Sofia Bennett was only 19, a bright-eyed village girl who dreamed of finishing school and becoming a nurse. Charles Whitmore was 71, a wealthy businessman feared and respected in equal measure, owner of half the farmland in the county. One was young, fragile, and still holding on to the taste of freedom. The other was old, powerful, and accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. Yet on a single rainy afternoon, their fates were bound by a marriage neither heart desired. Why would a man old enough to be her grandfather demand her as his bride? And what secret was so dangerous that Sofia's family would rather see her in his arms than let her walk away? The sky was the color of wet ashes as the Bennett's front yard filled with guests. The sharp smell of rain on red clay mixed with the sweet scent of jasmine garlands tied to the old wooden gate. But for Sofia, there was nothing sweet about this day. Her fingers dug into the rough fabric of her faded blue dress, the one her mother insisted she wear because, it's the last time you'll be seen as a simple girl. The whispers from neighbors felt like thorns pricking her skin. Inside the house, her father, Henry Bennett, stood tall in his worn suit, forcing a smile for the guests. To him, this marriage was not about love, it was survival. Charles Whitmore had paid off the family's crushing debts in exchange for Sofia's hand, and Henry's eyes told her there would be no room for argument. "You'll be grateful one day," her mother hissed when Sofia tried to speak. "A roof over your head is worth more than foolish dreams." The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Charles Whitmore stepped inside. His presence sucked the air out of the room. He was dressed in a black tailored suit, his silver hair slicked back, a gold watch glinting on his wrist. His cold gray eyes locked on Sofia as if she were an acquisition, not a bride. When he smiled, it wasn't warmth, it was possession. "Shall we begin?" Charles's voice was smooth, but it carried the weight of command. Sofia's knees trembled as she followed him to the makeshift altar in the living room. Every step felt like a chain tightening around her ankles. The rain pounded harder against the tin roof, drowning out her heartbeat. As the old pastor began the vows, she noticed a folded slip of paper being passed discreetly into her father's hand. Henry's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Charles before shoving the note into his pocket. Something about that exchange set her pulse racing. She repeated the vows in a daze, her voice cracking. When Charles slid the cold gold band onto her finger, his grip lingered too long, his thumb pressing into her skin as if sealing an unspoken pact. The guests clapped, some smiling, others avoiding her gaze. She felt like a lamb dressed in white, paraded for slaughter. But then, as the ceremony ended, her father's hand brushed hers for a moment, long enough for the slip of paper to fall into her palm. Sofia quickly hid it in the folds of her dress, her breath catching. It was a single sentence written in jagged ink. "If you value your life, do not go with him tonight." Sofia's fingers tightened around the slip of paper, its edges damp from the sweat of her palm. She didn't dare look at it again, afraid Charles might notice. He was standing just a few feet away, speaking to the guests with a calm authority that commanded the room. Her mind spun. Who had written the warning? And why? Charles turned to her. "Ready, my dear." His words were polite, but his eyes were unyielding steel. The rain outside had eased into a mist, but the air inside felt heavy, suffocating. Sofia glanced at her parents. Her mother stood with her arms folded, avoiding her gaze. Her father's jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching just beneath his temple. "Yes," she managed, her voice low. Charles offered his arm. She placed her hand on it, the warmth of his skin making her stomach twist. They stepped outside, the damp earth soft beneath her shoes. A sleek black car waited by the gate, its tinted windows hiding whatever lay inside. As they approached, Sofia risked a glance at her father. He looked away too quickly, but not before she caught the glimmer of guilt in his eyes. Inside the car, the leather seats smelled faintly of tobacco. Charles sat beside her, watching the raindrops slide down the window. "You will find I am a man of order," he began, his tone measured. "I expect respect, loyalty, and discretion. In return, you will never know hunger or danger. His words felt rehearsed, like an agreement she hadn't agreed to sign. When they reached his estate, Sofia's breath caught. The mansion rose from the mist like a fortress, its tall iron gates groaning as they swung open. Beyond them, stone walls loomed high, ivy crawling over their surface like dark veins. The inside was even more imposing. Rich mahogany floors, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and a chandelier dripping with crystal light. "You will stay in the East Wing," Charles said as they walked down a long corridor. "I value privacy." A maid appeared, her expression carefully neutral. She curtsied, then led Sofia into a spacious room with velvet drapes and a large bed covered in silk. When they were alone, Sofia pulled the note from her dress and stared at it again. "If you value your life, do not go with him tonight." A knock startled her. The maid stepped inside, her eyes darting toward the door before whispering, "Lock it. And don't open it for anyone." Sofia's pulse quickened. "Why?" The maid hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder. "Because the last girl who married Mr. Whitmore didn't survive the first week." Before Sofia could respond, the maid slipped out, closing the door behind her. Alone in the dim light, Sofia gripped the note until her knuckles turned white. The air in the room seemed colder now, heavier. Somewhere in the hallway, slow, deliberate footsteps began to draw closer. The footsteps were steady, each one echoing through the long corridor like the beat of a war drum. Sofia's eyes darted to the door. The key was already in the lock. With trembling fingers, she turned it, the click sounding far too loud in the silence. The shadows from the flickering wall lamp stretched across the floor, curling like black fingers toward her. The footsteps stopped. Her breath caught. She could feel someone standing just outside, the weight of their presence pressing against the wood. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. She didn't answer. Another knock, louder this time. "Sofia," the voice was Charles's, calm, almost gentle. But beneath it, there was something sharp, something that made the hair on her neck rise. "It's our first night. Why have you locked the door?" Her heart pounded. "I'm not feeling well," she called, forcing steadiness into her voice. Silence. When he spoke again, his tone was colder. "Marriage is not a place for secrets." The sound of his shoes on the floor retreated, fading into the distance. Sofia let out a shaky breath, sinking to the floor. She clutched the note and the maid's warning replayed in her mind, the last girl didn't survive the first week. The room suddenly felt smaller. She needed answers. The next morning, the house was alive with activity. Servants moved briskly, avoiding her gaze. Charles was nowhere to be seen. Sofia found the maid from last night polishing silver in the kitchen. "What happened to her?" Sofia asked in a whisper. The maid froze, her hands tightening around the cloth. Her name was Eleanor. She was 22. She fell from the balcony. Sofia narrowed her eyes. Fell, or was pushed. The maid glanced toward the door before leaning closer. "I heard shouting that night. Then nothing. The next morning, the master said she slipped. No one questioned it. No one dares." A chill swept through Sofia's body. "And before Eleanor?" The maid hesitated. "Two others. Both gone. One drowned. One disappeared." The air felt heavier, pressing against her lungs. That evening, Charles returned. He was dressed impeccably, smelling faintly of cigar smoke and rain. "Tomorrow, we'll dine with an important guest," he announced. "I expect you to look your best." Sofia forced a nod, her mind racing. As he left the room, she noticed something odd. On his cuff, barely visible against the crisp white fabric, was a smudge of what looked like dried red clay. The same clay from the path outside her family's home. Her stomach twisted. Had he been there before the wedding? Later that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. The slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. Only this time, they didn't stop at her door. They continued past, heading toward the balcony at the far end of the east wing. And then, a soft, high-pitched creak. The sound of a balcony door opening. The creak of the balcony door echoed faintly down the hallway, followed by a soft sigh of wind. Sofia sat up in bed, her heart thudding. The note and the maid's warning gnawed at her. What if Eleanor had died right there, just beyond that door? She slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold against the polished wood. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the old beams settling. The corridor stretched long and shadowy, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every step. At the far end stood the balcony door. The curtains billowed slightly, the moonlight painting silver ripples across the floor. Sofia's fingers closed around the brass handle. It was cold. She pushed it open slowly, wincing at the faint squeal of the hinges. The balcony overlooked the sprawling Whitmore estate, dark gardens below, a fountain glinting in the moonlight. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. She gripped the stone railing, leaning forward. It was a long drop to the ground, the flagstones below slick from rain. She could almost imagine a body lying there, broken, swallowed by shadows. Her skin prickled. Something about the railing felt wrong. She ran her fingers along its smooth edge and found a section near the corner that was rough, chipped. It looked as though part of it had been struck or pried loose. The stone bore faint marks, scratches, as though someone had clung to it desperately. Her throat tightened. Behind her, the faintest creak of floorboards. She spun around. The balcony door was still open, but a shadow stretched across the floor, tall, still, unmistakable. Couldn't sleep. Charles's voice was smooth, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. He stepped into the moonlight, his silver hair glowing faintly. I see you've found my favorite view. Sofia swallowed hard. I needed air. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes lingering on her hands gripping the railing. Careful. It's easy to slip. The words were simple, but his tone sent a shiver crawling down her spine. I wouldn't want you to have an accident, he added, almost lazily, before turning back toward the door. She followed him, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. That night, sleep didn't come. The image of Eleanor, her hands clawing at the stone, the chipped railing giving way, looped in her mind like a scene she couldn't erase. By morning, Sofia had made a decision. She would find out what happened to Eleanor, and the other two women. But to do that, she would need allies inside this house, and trust was a currency she didn't have. When she stepped into the hall the next day, the maid was waiting, a tray of tea in her hands. Without a word, she slid a small folded envelope beneath Sofia's saucer. Inside was a single message, written in the same jagged handwriting as the first note. Meet me in the garden at midnight. Come alone. The clock on the mantel ticked louder with each passing minute, as if urging her forward. Midnight was close. Sofia sat on the edge of her bed, dressed in a plain gray dress that blended into the shadows. Her bare feet made no sound as she slipped into the corridor. The mansion was different at night, quieter, yet alive in a strange way. The air seemed to hum with tension. Portrait eyes glistened faintly in the moonlight, and the polished floors reflected ghostly slivers of light from the windows. She avoided the east wing's creaky boards, moving like a shadow past closed doors. At the grand staircase, she paused, listening. No footsteps. The garden was only accessible through the side conservatory. The glass doors were cold under her fingers as she eased them open. Outside, the air was damp, carrying the rich scent of soil and night-blooming jasmine. The moon lit the stone paths in silver. She followed the faint crunch of gravel beneath her feet until she reached the old fountain at the garden center. The water whispered softly, its ripples catching the light. A figure stood in the shadows beneath an oak tree. Sofia froze. The person stepped forward, a young man, perhaps in his mid-twenties, with sharp features and eyes that darted nervously around the garden. His clothing marked him as one of the estate's groundskeepers. "You got my notes," he said in a low voice. Her heart thudded. "Who are you?" "My name's Daniel," he replied, glancing over his shoulder. "I worked here long before Eleanor. I know what happened to her." Sofia's breath caught. "Tell me." "She didn't fall," he said grimly. "She tried to escape. Whitmore caught her on the balcony. There was a struggle, he pushed her. Said it was an accident, but I saw the whole thing from the garden." Sofia's stomach turned. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because Whitmore owns them. And anyone who talks disappears. That's why I had to warn you." A cold wind swept through the garden, rustling the branches overhead. "You need to leave this place before it's too late," Daniel urged. "He's already planning something. That's why he wanted you, fresh blood, another wife to control. And if you step out of line..." A sharp crack split the air. Sofia flinched. Daniel's eyes widened, and he grabbed her arm. "Go. Now." Somewhere in the darkness beyond the hedges, a light flared, a lantern. Heavy footsteps crunched over the gravel. "Go." Daniel hissed again, shoving her toward the conservatory. She ran, her heart pounding, the scent of jasmine clinging to her. Behind her, voices rose, deep, commanding, furious. When she slipped back into her room and locked the door, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. Through the window, she saw the glow of lanterns moving in the garden, and then, two men dragging something toward the back of the estate. Something that looked like a body. The morning sun streamed through the velvet drapes, but the warmth didn't reach Sofia. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the garden below. The paths looked undisturbed, the fountain glistened in the light, yet she knew what she'd seen last night. The knock on her door made her jump. "Come in," she called, forcing her voice steady. The door opened, and Charles stepped inside, dressed in a crisp gray suit. His smile was polite, but his eyes searched her face like a hawk studying prey. "You were restless last night," he said casually, moving toward the window. "I heard movement in the halls." Her pulse quickened. "The storm woke me," she lied. He turned to face her, his silver hair catching the light. "Strange. I don't recall any storm." She swallowed hard. Charles walked closer, stopping just in front of her. "Marriage is built on trust, Sofia. Secrets poison it." Her throat felt dry. "I'm not keeping secrets." His gaze lingered for a moment longer before he straightened. "Good. Tonight, we're hosting a dinner for the mayor. I want you to be presentable." When he left, she exhaled sharply, the air burning in her lungs. The maid entered moments later with breakfast. Her eyes darted toward the door before she whispered, "Did you meet him?" Sofia nodded. "He told me about Eleanor, and the others." "But," her voice cracked. "I think they caught him last night." The maid's hands trembled as she set down the tray. "Then you must be careful. If they know he spoke to you," she trailed off, glancing toward the hallway. "Do you know where they would take him?" Sofia pressed. The maid hesitated. "There's an old storage shed beyond the north gardens. Servants aren't allowed there. I've seen men go in and out late at night." Sofia's mind raced. If Daniel was alive, he might be there. That afternoon, she tried to stay composed, helping the staff prepare for the dinner. The clink of silverware, the smell of roasted meats, and the low hum of voices filled the house. But Charles's eyes never left her. Even when speaking to the cook, he glanced her way, as if measuring every breath she took. As dusk fell, guests began arriving, wealthy men and women in fine clothes, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. Sofia moved through the room like a shadow, smiling when necessary, keeping her voice soft. But inside, her focus was on the north gardens. The shed. The possibility that Daniel might still be there. At one point, Charles leaned close to her, his breath warm against her ear. "You've been quiet tonight. Something on your mind?" She forced a smile. "Just tired." His lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then perhaps you should rest after dinner. No wandering." The words weren't a suggestion, they were an order. And that was when Sofia knew she would have to disobey him if she wanted to survive. The house had gone still after the last guest departed. The clink of glasses and polite laughter had long faded into silence. Sofia lay in bed fully dressed, listening for the sound she'd been waiting for, Charles's heavy footsteps retreating toward the west wing. When the creak of his door finally sounded, she gave it another 10 minutes before moving. The moon hung low, spilling pale light across the gardens. The night air was cold, carrying the faint scent of damp soil. Sofia slipped out the side door, her shoes muffled against the grass as she kept to the shadows. The north gardens were wilder, less manicured than the rest of the estate. Overgrown hedges loomed like dark walls, and the crunch of gravel beneath her feet felt too loud in the silence. At last, she saw it, the shed. It was a squat wooden structure, its boards weathered and dark, as though it had been standing for centuries. A padlock hung from the door, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Her pulse quickened. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the thin hairpin she'd taken from her dressing table earlier. She'd never picked a lock before, but desperation was a good teacher. Minutes stretched like hours until she heard the satisfying click. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the scent of oil and dust. The faint moonlight revealed shelves stacked with crates and tarps. Then she saw it, movement in the corner. "Daniel," she whispered. A shadow stirred, and a pair of wide, frightened eyes caught the light. Daniel was slumped against the wall, his hands bound, his shirt torn. "Sofia," his voice was hoarse. "You shouldn't have come." She rushed to him, fumbling at the ropes. "We're getting out of here." But before she could free him, a new sound sliced through the night, the crunch of footsteps outside the shed. Slow. Deliberate. Her blood went cold. "Hide," Daniel hissed. She ducked behind a stack of crates just as the door creaked open. Moonlight spilled in, silhouetting a tall figure in the doorway. Charles. He stepped inside, the glow from the moon casting his features in sharp relief. His expression was calm, but his voice carried a dangerous softness. "You've been busy, Daniel." Daniel said nothing, his jaw clenched. Charles's gaze drifted across the shed, pausing for just a fraction too long near the crates where Sofia hid. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. "You could have lived a quiet life here," Charles said, almost conversationally. "But instead, you chose to meddle." He stepped closer, his hand disappearing into his coat pocket. When it emerged, something glinted in the pale light, metal. Sofia's stomach dropped. The glint of metal caught the moonlight. Charles was holding a revolver. The polished barrel looked almost elegant in his hand, but Sofia knew what it meant. "Last chance, Daniel," Charles said, his voice low, steady. "Tell me who else you've spoken to, and maybe I'll let you see another sunrise." Daniel's chest rose and fell, but his voice was defiant. "You're a coward, Whitmore. You hide behind your money, your threats." The crack of the gunshot split the air. The sound was deafening in the small shed, and the acrid scent of gunpowder filled the space. Sofia's heart leapt into her throat. Charles had fired into the wall just inches from Daniel's head. "Next time," Charles said coldly, "I won't miss." She knew she had seconds, maybe less. Her eyes scanned the dim shed. Beside her, on a low shelf, sat a heavy metal wrench, its surface slick with dust. Her pulse roared in her ears as she reached for it, praying the movement was quiet enough to go unnoticed. Charles crouched down in front of Daniel, his voice dropping to a whisper Sofia couldn't hear. Then, without warning, his head tilted slightly, toward her hiding place. "I know you're here, Sofia," he said softly. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, he straightened, turning toward the crates. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, the revolver hanging loosely at his side. "You've been a curious little bride. Too curious." Her grip on the wrench tightened until her knuckles ached. When he was only a step away, she moved. With every ounce of strength she had, she swung the wrench, the metal connecting with a sickening crack. Charles staggered back, his grip on the revolver faltering. Sofia lunged, grabbing the gun before it hit the floor. Her hands trembled, the weight of it unfamiliar and terrifying. Charles was on his knees, dazed but still conscious, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and disbelief. "You think you can run from me?" Daniel's voice snapped her back to the moment. "Sofia, untie me. Now." She tossed the gun to him and pulled at the ropes around his wrists. They came loose faster this time, and Daniel was on his feet in seconds, the revolver steady in his hands. But Charles wasn't done. With a growl, he lunged forward, his hands reaching for Sofia's throat. The gunshot that followed was deafening. Charles froze, a look of stunned shock in his eyes. Slowly, he collapsed to the floor, the life draining from his face. The shed was silent except for Sofia's ragged breathing. Her hands were cold, her knees weak. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low. "We don't have much time." If anyone heard that. From outside, the crunch of hurried footsteps on gravel. Multiple pairs. Getting closer. The sound of boots pounding against gravel grew louder, the rhythm of pursuit. Daniel grabbed Sofia's hand and yanked her toward the back of the shed. "There's a service path that leads to the stables," he whispered. "If we can make it there, we might have a chance." The shed door rattled, someone was trying the handle. Sofia's heart slammed against her ribs as they slipped out through a narrow side opening. The cold night air hit her face, sharp and damp. They darted through the tall hedges, their shadows swallowing them whole. Behind them, voices rose, angry, urgent. "Search the gardens. Don't let them get to the gates." The estate grounds seemed endless. The moonlight revealed glimpses of the fountain, the glint of windows, and the jagged black outlines of the trees. Every step they took felt like an eternity. Daniel kept her close, his grip firm but protective. "Stay low," he murmured. "If they see us, we're finished." They reached the stables, the faint smell of hay and horses wrapping around them. Daniel pushed open the side door, ushering her inside. The horses stirred, their hooves shuffling nervously. He moved quickly, cutting a rope from the wall and looping it into makeshift reins. "We'll take the fastest one." Sofia's fingers shook as she helped him prepare the horse. The distant shouts were growing sharper now, closer. The horse whinnied softly, as if sensing the urgency. Daniel mounted first, then reached down to pull Sofia up behind him. "Hold tight," he said, his voice low and urgent. The moment the stable door swung open, they burst into the open night. The horse's hooves thundered against the earth, the wind tearing at Sofia's hair. Lantern light flashed from the gardens as guards turned toward them, shouting. One of them raised a rifle. "Down!" Daniel barked. Sofia ducked low against his back. A shot rang out, the bullet whistling past them. They sped toward the far end of the property, where the iron gates loomed tall and black against the moonlit sky. "Those gates, how do we get through?" Sofia shouted over the wind. Daniel's jaw was tight. "We don't. We go over." As they neared the gates, he veered the horse toward the side, where the fence dipped near a small maintenance shed. With one final push, the horse leapt, hooves striking the top before clearing it. They landed hard on the other side, the jolt rattling Sofia's teeth. For a brief, dizzying moment, it seemed they were free. But then, hoofbeats. Behind them. Multiple riders. Daniel's voice was grim. "They're following us." Sofia clung to him, the night rushing past in a blur of dark fields and silver light. The riders were gaining. She could hear their shouts now, sharp and certain. Daniel leaned low over the horse's neck. "If they catch us, it's over." Ahead, the land dropped suddenly into a steep ravine. There was no going around it. And Daniel didn't slow down. The ravine loomed ahead, its dark depths swallowing the moonlight. The roar of water far below mixed with the pounding of hooves. Sofia's breath came in short gasps. "Daniel," she shouted over the rush of wind. "We can't. We have no choice," he cut her off, his voice a razor's edge. The horse's muscles bunched beneath them, the ground vibrating with every stride. The shouts of the riders behind them grew sharper, closer. A shot cracked through the night, splintering bark from a nearby tree. Sofia's arms tightened around Daniel's waist. The ravine was seconds away now, the far side just barely visible in the pale light. Daniel leaned low, whispering to the horse like a prayer. At the last moment, he pulled the reins tight and gave a sharp kick. The horse surged forward. For a heartbeat, they were airborne, the cold night air rushing past, the abyss yawning below. Sofia's scream caught in her throat. Then, impact. The horse landed hard on the far bank, stumbling before regaining its footing. They were across. Behind them, the riders skidded to a halt at the edge. None dared follow. Daniel didn't stop until they were deep into the woods, the sounds of pursuit fading into nothing. Finally, he slowed, bringing the horse to a trembling halt near a stream. Sofia slid down, her legs unsteady. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs, the adrenaline still surging through her veins. Daniel dismounted, tying the horse loosely to a tree. "We're safe. For now." She stared at him, the night's events crashing over her in waves. "What now? Where do we go?" He met her gaze, his eyes shadowed. "We get as far from Whitmore's reach as possible. And then, we tell the truth." She hesitated. "The police. They won't listen," he said sharply. "Not unless we have proof." Sofia's mind flashed back to the shed, the ropes, the chipped railing on the balcony, the whispers of Eleanor and the others. Proof might still be in that house, but going back was suicide. Daniel's expression softened. "You've been braver than you know. But this isn't over." She swallowed hard, a cold resolve settling in her chest. "Then we end it. One way or another." He nodded, as if they'd just made a silent pact. The first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, painting the forest in shades of gold. The horrors of the night felt almost unreal in that quiet moment. But Sofia knew better. Somewhere back in that grand, ivy-covered house, a man's body lay cooling on the floor of a shed, and his empire would soon come hunting for whoever put him there. And now, she was no longer just a frightened bride. She was the last witness. And the only one left who could bring Charles Whitmore's legacy crashing down.